for the second webinar about mind traps. And we are going to today explore kind of what gets us trapped and how do we get out? And what have we been practicing with? And this is a kind of experimental run for us all as we learn together. So I expect, as I told you last time, I expect that I will learn as much from you as you will learn from me, and we will learn as much from each other, which is what makes a community fantastic. So I would like us to start just by centering in together and checking in with ourselves. And so I know that some of you are walking and some of you are outside and some of you are doing other things, but just for a moment, if we could just stop. So if it's possible for you to stop, if you're not driving, just stop and see if you can feel your feet on the floor. See if you can feel held by the floor, by the chair, by whatever's holding you today. And see if you can feel nourished by your breath. And really direct your attention to the idea that your breath keeps you alive. It's like the most delightful thing you get to do is breathe. See if you can experience the sensations of breathing and the delight of that. And use this quiet space to look inside you and see what's going on in there. What are the texture of my thoughts right now? What's the velocity and direction and texture, the weather system of my thoughts? I'm not wondering what you're thinking about or wondering what are the thoughts like. And in that same way, I'm wondering, what are your emotions like? How many emotions can you find in you right now? If they come at you in a tangled ball of yarn, could you untangle them and lay out the colors before you, one by one? How many colors in your tangled ball of emotions? And then with that inventory of inside you, now we can think about the larger context of here and what we're here for. And I'm going to bring us a poem called Sometimes by David Whyte. Sometimes, if you move carefully through the forest, breathing like ones in the old stories who could cross a shimmering bed of dry leaves without a sound, you come to a place whose only task is to trouble you with tiny but frightening requests conceived out of nowhere, but in this place beginning to lead everywhere. Requests to stop what you are doing right now and to stop what you are becoming while you do it. Questions that can make or unmake a life. Questions that have patiently waited for you. Questions that have no right to go away. Check in with yourself for just a moment about those questions. And when you are ready, take one more deep breath. Open your eyes. Join us together. Michael can start walking again. Welcome. Welcome. So last time we talked a little bit about the ladders out of the mind traps together, and one of them is this this question of how do we really check in with ourselves, and how do we become connected to what's going on inside us, and what are the things that are up for us. So we start there today, and my hope today is for us in this smaller group to be able to connect with one another, to share ideas together. I'll teach a little stuff to you, you'll teach a little stuff to us, and we will together construct something that feels more helpful and robust about how do we actually use these mind traps as a way to improve our lives and find a new way forward. So my request is that everybody finds some way to participate today. Like maybe you participate in the chat, and maybe you participate in the small groups, and maybe you unmute yourself when it's time to talk as a large group, but that everybody just watches to find some way in to make our space together so that we are collectively making it. Does that make sense? Does that seem like a good plan? Cool. Okay, so here's my plan. My plan is that we will, and we're gonna try some stuff out that we've never tried before that might be disastrous. And so we might not have the technological capability to do some of the things that we're gonna do. And so some things we do might just fail. But you know, that's what we're on for. So I think the first thing we're gonna try is a poll, which we've never done before. So let's just see. I don't have any idea how this works. Joy is supposed to know how this works, but with technology, one never knows. And so we have a question for you about which is the trappiest. Like you've been playing with these ideas over the last couple of weeks, hopefully. And have you found a mind trap that's the trappiest one for you? And Joy's gonna figure out, oh, look at that. It like pops right there on the screen. Like I can take it too. I know which one is for me. Submit. Look at that. Very interesting, isn't it? That's super interesting.
Cool.
Ego and agreement are the big grabbers. Very interesting. Thank you. So we're gonna start by talking about some of your stories, and we'll go trap by trap and start with, let's start with the one that was the sort of the least trappy, and see whether anybody's had any experience exploring and playing with the mind trap of simple stories. You'll remember that one is the one where we get trapped by the way we tell ourselves quite simple stories with very tight cause and effect lines, and we create simple characters like heroes and villains in those stories. And I wonder if anybody has a story of either noticing yourself telling one of these simple stories, or of actually being able to get out of one of these simple stories. And
this is Mike. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Mike.
I find myself I've always loved the hero's journey story, and it's a great structure and recognizing the obstacles that we all go through and the long journey. So I think it's a valuable story, but it's also one that at any point in time you can recognize that you're at any of the different points within that journey, and it's not just a clear beginning and end, because you might be going through one struggle that leads to a whole new beginning, that leads to more ahead. And so the journey keeps continuing. And I have to keep reminding myself that it's much more beyond just the simple structures.
It's super helpful, Mike, what you say, because it cuts both ways, right? And our simple stories so often do, right? On the one hand, they help us, they're a guide to us, they support us. And on the other hand, they can mislead us and become a thing that actually gets in the way of our accomplishing the things that we want to do. And I think the hero's journey itself is a really interesting one, because it's on the one hand this framework that many of us can look at, it's archetypal, it's calls to us and connects us, and on the other hand it can create a rigidity and also a sense that we kind of know what the other characters are on about. Who else has been playing with simple stories and noticing them? Thanks, Mike.
Hi. I just noticed I didn't send the rest of my message, but there it actually is. Yeah, I definitely noticed myself telling many simple stories. I'm part of a project at the moment where we have to kind of make sense and get to sort of themes of a group of specifically undergraduate students, and they all have very interesting journeys, but they are an at-risk population, and I have been noticing how much I am simplifying what they're going through and trying to understand who they are and what sort of variables impacting their journeys. And it was incredibly helpful to just hold this idea of simple stories in my mind. And particularly tell myself and some of our group members to, what other stories are we hearing? Are there at least 3? I think we talked about it on the meeting previously. What other storylines are there that we're not seeing? So just kind of the number 3 was helpful, to me, to say, are there about 3 stories? And then also, I think we talked about how is the villain the hero and the hero possibly the villain. And the way I kind of understood that is, whatever the characters are in the story, how can they be the opposite? If the student is the victim, how can others be possibly the heroes, or how could it be the other way around? How can somebody else who seemingly, were perpetuating some situations for the students, how could they be, had good intentions, and then the students were the ones possibly in the wrong. So it was just incredibly helpful to keep that idea in mind as I kind of try to unpack what was with the sense we're making. And I found it challenging because on the one hand, we want to simplify and get sort of to themes, and on the other hand, there's this richness. So it's kind of like, how do we dive into individual sort of rich stories? But then on the other hand, how do we get a collective group sort of interpretation of what's going on? So yeah, that was super helpful to me over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, lovely story. I love the way you're playing with the opposites, and I love the way you are using these with colleagues to try and get a new set of possibilities into the room. Yeah. Could you say, you said it was helpful. What did it help?
It was helping to really understand that there are many sides and many variables to what we're seeing. It just pointed out to me that it's such sometimes confirmation bias or a self-fulfilling prophecy, or kind of trying to find stories that confirms the story I'm telling myself about, the student in front of me, or that I think is the true story. And then with more discovery, we realized that there's more going on. It's not just this. And we just had partial story, or maybe the story I had was, just a couple of years, but there's so much more that happened before then that is so helpful in terms of understanding and therefore designing an intervention to really help them going forward. So I think it's definitely been helpful in the sense that it pointed out to me there's so many multiple perspectives involved here, and I am so captured in my own little view of what I think is going on for this person. So yeah.
Super helpful. Thank you, Cecily.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing it to our community.
Okay, can we have one more?
I'll jump in. Can you hear me?
Yep, we sure can. Beautiful day.
So one thing that I find helps a lot, and it's surprising to me that I need to create a cue to myself to remember, is remembering my own ignorance and the illusion that I know what what other people are thinking, or what they mean to say, or even that I understand the substance of a conversation.
Yeah, beautiful, Michael. And why does that help you? Like, what does that enable, that memory?
So similar to, I can't remember the name of the person who said that most mind traps involve ego. It helps me to listen, to stop and listen and reflect, and to direct my attention to being curious about what's going on, rather than cycling through my own intuitive or quick responses.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. So it gets you out of your kind of reflexes that are about speed and pattern recognition from things that you've seen in the past, and this might not be the thing that you've seen in the past. This is why these mind traps aren't really traps in some circumstances, but they are traps in complexity. If it's not clear what's going to happen next, and you've never seen one of these before, your pattern recognition is not a thing for you to blindly rely on. Very cool. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
Okay, so there we've played a little bit with simple stories, and also Michael was helping us cross the bridge into this question of rightness and into this listening space. And I thought maybe we would play a little bit. In the book I reference the difference between different kinds of listening, but I thought today we would play with those different kinds of listening and just explore them a little bit, and feel it a little bit, and see how they arrive for us. And what we notice is we see different forms of listening to each other. And I thought to do that, I might look for a volunteer who might be willing to be listened to by me in 3 different ways right here. This is just as a spoiler alert, some of my listening is going to be kind of crappy. And so you might want to not bring me some deeply poignant issue. But if there's something that you're like trying to make a decision about, or you're a little bit torn about, or you kind of are feeling frustrated about, or something like that, and you wouldn't mind sharing with us here, I would love for somebody to just unmute and be willing to play along for a minute while we explore the difference between listening to win, listening to fix, and listening to learn. Just to have a play with that space. Anybody willing to play along?
I'm game.
Excellent. Thank you, Sue. Okay, so what we're going to be playing with here is just this idea of how does the mind trap of rightness get in our way, right? And how does being in it do what Michael was just suggesting, and how does getting out of it make new possibilities? So I think one of the ways it gets in our way is by fundamentally changing the way we show up with other people. So if the mind trap of rightness is confusing basically our feeling of rightness for the truth, and therefore believing that we have some access to the right way for ourselves or for other people, in complexity where there is no right way, then getting out of it requires some fancy footwork around doing this thing where we remember to be curious instead of believe that we know the right answers. So I would love for you to just tell me what's going on for you, and I'm going to listen to you in these 3 different ways, and you're going to see how it feels. Other people are going to see how it feels, and then we're just going to have a little talk about that.
I'm going to go with the one that seems more actionable. So I find myself more often sort of going into spaces where I'm facilitating. So creating containers, not unlike what you're doing here. And it's not necessarily my home base. I'm much more an introverted creative. But so what I notice is I have great models of this and grand plans, and I know what it looks like when it from the receiving end, when it goes well. Little things like the centering exercise you did just feel very they really shift kind of what is it we're about here, that sort of sense, that felt sense. So the challenge I've been having is I've convened a group here in Baltimore to play with the things that I like to play with. Tools like Kinevin framework and Wardley mapping and polarity mapping and you name it, like just the fun stuff. And so the people have been showing up, usually about 8. And the first one was kind of a disaster because I'm like, ooh, this is just people who want to play with the things that I want to play with. So we'll just show up and play with the things. But people were very ungrounded and like, what are we doing here? So then we did another one, and there was a little play introduced, which was super fun, some Theater of the Oppressed games from Augusto Boal, and that felt really good. But what I noticed when we get down to the sense making, when we get down to dialogue and conversation, not only do people keep looking to me to sort of validate what they're saying, I'm like doing it. Like I'm actually opining about complexity or like, so it doesn't feel like I'm creating a generative space. I don't actually know how the participants feel about that, but like things like closing circles are really important to me. We've yet to do one that actually felt like a closing circle.
Okay, so I mean, I think you just need to keep going at it, right? Like you've been practicing, you just keep carrying on, keep practicing. You learn a little bit each time, and you are going to be awesome. By the 4th time you do this thing, it's going to be rocking good. So I think just go for it.
So I am going for it in even scarier contexts.
Can I pause you for just a minute?
Oh, sorry.
Can I pause you for just a minute and just check in and see how was that response for you?
Oh, thanks. Very sort of like what a friend who was trying to validate me would say. Yeah. Like you're fine.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Yeah. So if we step off the dance floor and into the balcony, the listening to win, I think very often has that feel, right? That feel of like, you know, it can show up in a couple of different ways. And one of the ways is like, I really want to beat you at something. But a lot of the ways, I think the time when it's the most pernicious, like when it's the most sneaky and we're falling into the mind trap in the most sneaky way, is when we do this kind of, you go girl, kind of, you're awesome, it's all good, you don't need to worry about that, it's going to be sweet, just carry on. Because it's not actually listening, right? And I don't actually know, but there's something about it that feels kind of mutually soothing. And so it's not that it's a bad thing to do. It's just that in complexity, it probably doesn't advance things very much, right? And it leaves you with not necessarily a new insight or a new place. And it leaves me not particularly having learned anything either, right? Because the whole time you're talking, I'm just thinking, how can I comfort her, right? How can I make it so she's not so nervous? And a lot of the time, I think that the thing that we are trying to do is listen to make other people's problems go away, because other people's problems make us uncomfortable. We need to make it go away in some way. And so, yeah, Nedra says it feels like fixing your own anxiety, right? So I'm not really fixing you because I haven't added anything to you, but I am kind of like trying to say, you'll be okay so that I don't need to deal with it anymore, in a way. Now, if I were to listen to this thing from a kind of listening to fix you. So I like, Nedra, that listening to fix me and my need for you to feel okay. If I were to listen in a way that was meant to fix you, I might go into something kind of more problem solving. So we'll go back onto the dance floor together, and I'll give you a different response, and we'll play with that response for a minute. Okay, Sue? So you haven't gotten to the closing circle. So how are you watching your time? Like what are you doing to track time in your sessions to be sure that you can allow yourself enough time for a satisfying closing circle?
Oh, I'm supposed to answer that.
As you wish. Unless it feels like such a waste of time.
No, it feels like there's this like back in the mind, like I'm aware of it, and it makes me anxious that like, oh, so wait, am I supposed to answer the actual question or respond to your question?
What was the back of the mind thing? Was that the actual question, or is that the response?
That was like, and as if you asked me that question for real, and I really tried to actually answer your question for real, as opposed to answering how it made me feel to be asked it.
Yeah. Okay, so answer.
Yeah, so in real time, I'm like aware that time is getting short, but that I'm gonna have to like control the group to get the like it feels control-y, and I want people to have fun, and I want people to have autonomy. And so I think so if I were to switch now to how it feels to be asked that, it feels better than the first, because I think that tends to be when I heard you ask the question, how are you going about this? How are you doing? Blah, 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 blah. I was like, I could hear my own voice talking to my friend Gabby, who has a back injury. I'm like, oh my God, I do that all the time. I don't usually do the first. I don't do the everything will be fine, you're rocking it. I do the listening to fix is my habit.
Yeah, because then we could go into like, if you set a timer and you did some breathing before the last break, could you get to the circle? And, we could like do all this, like, I know some ways that you could do better, right? And that's like, that helps me feel like a hero, and it helps, and sometimes people get like genuine value out of those things. So it's not like it's a naughty thing to do. It just stays. You see how I'm still in the mind trap of rightness, right? Because it's me thinking, oh, I don't quite know what's going to happen, but in a couple sentences, I'm going to be able to fix this thing, right? I'm going to be able to figure it out, and then I'll be able to solve you. And it's as I said, it's not a naughty move. It's just a move that keeps me standing in power and me sort of helping you who need my help in some way, instead of having us be learners together. So let me try a third way, a third approach. And And I think David is asking, is there a listen to connect? Let's do this one and see what we get. So here's what I think of as listening to learn. And let me start by saying that I have been listening to you, and let me see if I can frame this challenge in the way that I'm understanding it so far, and you can just let me know what I'm missing. So you've been doing these workshops, and they've been, you're kind of going into a new space and inviting people into this new space with you, and they're showing up, and that's delightful. And there are some things about them where you are learning that you can't fully express the things in the moment with them as they kind of show up when you're making your spaces in your mind by yourself, or doing your kind of more internal artistic work, is kind of how I heard it. Like, you get these other people, and then there are all these competing commitments you have and competing ways to talk to them that are kind of throwing you off of your ideal, it sounds like. Is that a fair kind of summary?
I think so. I think the ideal is aspirational. And so it's more habitual, that kind of showing up that I fall into, perhaps.
So it's habitual. I'm hearing that you're like struggling to balance some either values or polarities or both, it sounds like there's this having fun, and also it seems like there's content you care about, there's letting things emerge, but there are also real solid pieces of group time that you care about. I don't know whether those are balancing values or balancing polarities in the moment or something like that, but it seems like there's a lot going on that's kind of hard to balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Play and informality is definitely a value I've named for myself. It's harder for me to name this thing that, I'll just use this example again, that we watched you create with the grounding. That is something I value, but the creation of it in this context is very foreign to me. If I were teaching yoga, it would not be foreign to me. But there is what I think it is this. So I keep going back to ego, because it feels risky to bring a contemplative self or a goofy, playful self into an intellectual environment. And so maybe it's three things that I'm trying to balance. And I know that's not your standard polarity, but I got the play in there. It's almost like I can hold two at a time, but then if I want like the one that I think I really have contextualized here in this group for my peers is about tools. And they're tools that are heavyweight tools. They're not easy to learn. And I've practiced for years and years and years. And now I don't want to practice by myself. I want people. I want playmates. And so I think I do hear in naming the tensions that you did, those are definitely what I feel like I'm navigating in those moments. Many simultaneous.
It sounds like they're not just values, they're like almost identities of yours. And so you're holding these multiple identities all at once in some way.
That makes sense. There are lots of them.
And so you've got the 7 or 8 people that have come to join you, but you've also got like the 7 or 8 Sues that are inside you. And now you've got a bigger group than you were planning on somehow to manage them all.
Yeah. And I don't know, I know a couple of the people, but a lot of them were just friends of friends or local business people, nonprofit people who were interested. So then there's this, I feel like there is this whole like I've got all the identities in here. They don't even know they don't know any of them. So they don't even know which one to ground me in.
Yeah. So it's you wrestling with all the yous, but you also wrestling with their visions of you. How do you help them hold a coherent vision of the ideas and you and their progress through them and all these other things? Okay, we're going to take a time out there and just explore what was the difference between that part of our conversation and the earlier parts of the conversation.
So the first question triggered kind of a yeah, but response. For some reason, I'm just naming it. The second one triggered a sort of a, oh my God, I do that response. And the third one just seemed to really, it really was generative in my mind for all the sort of forces at work in those moments. The many tensions. I often imagine a spring system. That's what comes to mind as I hear what you say, and then I start talking. I see sort of the spring system. So it just felt much more generative.
Yeah, interesting. And for me, the way it shows up for me as an experience is like the first ones I was trying to get through to something, right? Like I wanted you to change in some way. And in this third one, I felt like we're just exploring a thing together. So there's this funny irony that in the first ones, I was meaning to be helpful. And in this one, I was meaning less to be helpful, right? Like the first one I was trying to, when I was listening to Fix, when I was listening to Win, I was really trying to like make you know you were great and it was all going to be fine and you were on the right path. And when I was in the more listening to Fix place, I was like, oh, next time we're going to get her to that closing circle and it's going to feel great. But this time I didn't want to take you anywhere. I just wanted to understand what you were doing and how that experience was for you. I know that lots of us on the call are professional listeners. And at the same time, I know that I'm a professional listener too. And I still spend a ton of my time slipping out of listening to learn and slipping into these other forms of listening. And so I'm curious, what is it for you that slips you out of a deep connected listening and into one of these more rightness based listening moves, like listening to Win or listening to Fix? Anybody have any sense of what does that to you? I'm happy to take it in the chat or, yeah, Phil, I see you.
For me, it's wanting to help.
Yeah.
Wanting to help make something better.
Yeah. Yeah, that deep desire, right?
Very.
Yeah.
Very deep.
Yeah. I noticed that in myself, that often it's the hardest for me when I care the most about the person or the topic. So one of the probably the two people I have the hardest time in the world remembering to listen to learn to are my kids. You know, they come to me with a challenge and I'm so much less likely to, oh wow, let me really sit with you in that. And I'm so much more like, okay, so do you need money, or like, what do you need? What do you need for that? Like, you know, like, did you try saying this? Did you contact your professor? And like, no, that wasn't the point. And sometimes it is the point, and that's okay too. But yeah, thank you, Phil. Other things that people notice, Nedra?
I have one that's just simply when I'm overextended, I can't slip into the discovery mode with a client or a friend or my kids who are adult kids. So if I'm centered and settled, and often I'm not, then I just go right to those. I just wanted to sense. Yeah. So unlike Phil, I don't always want to help. deeply want to help. Sometimes I just want to get it off my list.
Yeah, you just want to tick it off, right? You just want to get it off your to-do list. Yeah.
But I love this exercise. Just really fun to notice the difference between consulting and coaching.
Yeah. 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 And the difference between standing over here and looking at something and standing shoulder to shoulder and looking with someone. And how do we get out of totally cool to be consulting when it's time to consult, but how do we notice that we're doing it and make a choice instead of getting driven by our desire to help or our desire to get it off our plate or our own physical discomfort at somebody else's discomfort.
Okay. I'm totally going to remember you saying, it's not naughty. It's not a naughty move. But make it conscious.
Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, very cool. So that's our exploration of this rightness mind trap. Anything else anybody want to say about the rightness mind trap before we move on to another one? Okay. Oh,
Julie,
no. Go.
Hi, Jennifer here. I think for me, it's like you were talking about, for me, often it's not wanting to stretch people to an uncomfortable place, that you want to hold them well. But what stops is this notion that we've both stopped learning. So suddenly the learning has stopped, which is such a shame.
So interesting. Yeah. Sometimes I love the connection you're making there between learning and discomfort, right? Sometimes we slip into some of these places just to feel comfortable and to help other people feel comfortable.
Yes.
And sometimes that's a service and sometimes it's not a service. And again, we want to be knowing, when are we doing this and why?
Yep, exactly. Cool. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Okay, so.
Okay. One more thing about rightness.
Yeah, one more thing. Yeah, Mike.
For me, what struck me most about the rightness trap was a lot of my own inner work, not just with other people, but just a sense of you often kind of say you can or can't do this because it is this way, and you kind of know for certain in your own head that is true. And the times where I grow are the times where you can kind of have that conversation and challenge, is it right or not, which goes to one of the other traps as well. But that sense of just locking in on knowing what is right can also trap you.
Oh yeah. And it's one of the ways that our experience gets in the way, right? Because we think, oh, I've seen this before and I know exactly what you do. I know that arises for me with my kids, but also I notice it sometimes with my clients. I'll notice that I'm trying to ask questions that are designed to generate a particular insight. And I'm like, look at me, I know what insight you're supposed to have. Like, that is so trapped by rightness. How can I get out and let you have the discoveries you're gonna have? I can have my own insights, that's cool, but that doesn't make them your insights, So how do I get out of that and remember this is a different thing we're doing? We are co-explorers in this space instead of, I'm the guide and I know the insight path that we're supposed to follow here.
I remember that book Blink years ago, where the whole premise is that you have those deep kind of instinctive sense of what's right and wrong, and once you believe that, it reinforces your sense that you are right.
That's right. That's exactly right. And it's often true, but when it's not true, we don't know. We don't know.
I have a question that's kind of influenced by some of what's happening in the chat room around the dimension of time. Yeah. And when there's time pressure, how that kind of fuels that urge. And it makes me wonder, like, how to be with that. Because some things that can also happen, and think about an example where I often do like one-off coaching sessions with clients, and they kind of see me in the role of guide. And as much as I kind of want to be a co-explorer with them, there's a way in which I'm a part of a system where my worth isn't in line with purely listening to learn. And there's an element at which listening to fix might be valuable, and I don't really know how to like walk that balance.
Yeah, so I'm hearing two different things, both important in what you ask. The first one is about time, and let's just call time pressure, right? Let's just call, there are lots of different kinds of pressure, but let's just look at the way pressure changes us. And this is one of the things I'm super curious about these days, because I think generally pressure pushes us deeper into mind traps, right? It amplifies the strength of those traps. And the problem is that complexity, uncertainty, ambiguity, those are all pressures. And as they amplify our likelihood of getting trapped, we are going farther and farther in the wrong direction from how we need to be in complexity. And I see that not just in myself in daily situations, I see that on the global stage, right? I think we can see the way pressure across the world is taking people farther and farther into the mind traps that are creating simplistic solutions to really complex problems. So I'm very curious about what are the practices we can have that let us notice pressure, but not be tricked into having to react, right? Our bodies are designed to experience pressure and then go, right? Like that's our design, because the pressures that we're designed for are instant and deadly, and right? Like that's what our nervous system is designed for. So how can we understand that there are pressures, that most of the pressures we feel today are in some way manufactured, right? Like they're not that kind of pressure. They're a totally different kind of pressure. And how do we recognize in ourselves the pressure of time, busyness, another email, like the expectations of your clients? All of those are forms of pressure. And how can we see, oh, this is my body under pressure, and now I need to make choices instead of going with our reflexes under those conditions. And I would love to figure out more about how to do that for the whole world. So one of the things I'd like to talk about next time is how do we support groups in this place, but we can play with that next time. And then the second question, I'm going to take a fork in the road for the second question, right? In what way are you experiencing a kind of pressure that is saying you need to deliver X number of insights in the next 50 minutes? I really know that feeling, so I know what you're talking about. And you're telling yourself a story that says, therefore, I need to kind of listen to fix because that's what they hired me for. And how much is it that people want to be supported to find their own pathway through, but they just don't know? That's such an unfamiliar terrain for them. They can't possibly ask for it because they've never had that experience before. And truly, I don't know the context of your one-off coaching sessions, and it might be one and it might be the other. But I love that we could be asking that question and that you could be experimenting, you know, from person to person sometimes to see, you know, like what is it you would like from this session? I have some experience. I could tell you stuff. I could recognize patterns and tell you stuff. Or I could help you find the stuff that's in you already. But I don't know what that is. But we could explore together.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna move to agreement, and we're gonna do that a totally different way. Again, you can see I'm playing with different modalities and just exploring together. And so I'm gonna attempt to play a little video clip, and I just want you to watch what happens in your body. So before I play the clip, I want you to just check in with yourself right now. Like, what does it feel like to be you right now? What do you notice about what you can feel in your body. And then I notice my heart quickens actually at the thought of sharing my screen, which sometimes doesn't go well. I think I'm managing it. And then we're gonna watch this it's just a little clip from a movie. Just watch yourself.
Later, let's just do them now. Take 50.
Oh, see, right there.
Oh, no, my demo! I'm gonna go do the dishes.
Cool.
It'd be nice if you helped me.
No problem. Get them a little bit later. I'm just gonna.
Okay, I just want you to check in with yourself and notice, what am I feeling right now? What am I feeling? What do I notice in my sensations? What happened during that little clip?
I'm happy to share.
Yeah.
Well, it's a lot of things happened. So if I start, I think it started from the midriff. We talked about body sensation and nothing more. So midriff. Some later on, some tension in the hands, some in the knees. But later on, the discussion became like a mental discussion. So and also it looked a bit in my head, and then it shifted to it's like the light sensations around, like under the eyes, a bit like a bit of kind of irritation. Mm. So there's a bit like it was shifting around. So I think that was a bit the journey of in my body, so to speak.
Super interesting. And were there emotions that were associated with those things?
Not in the beginning. Later on, some frustration maybe, or some irritation about the pointlessness of the discussion. Well, it was a bit judgmental here. Huh? Judgmental. There's like the fact that there was a judgment there. We're like, okay. Then I felt like it was like focusing on my face. So I was thinking, okay, this is happening there.
So interesting. Interesting. Yeah. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Somebody else, what did you notice about yourself there? Heaviness and sadness. Thank you, Monsi. What else? Okay, so interesting. So as I look at the chat, I'm seeing people have like an anxiety, tension, tightness, shallow breath. And then there are like those people who are like, yeah, it's a Jennifer Aniston movie. It's sort of kind of funny. And, you know, so there are these different sets of experiences. But I guess the thing that I'm wanting to explore is the bodily sensation, which some of us have just experienced, of being in conflict or even watching conflict, right? So as we play with the mind trap of agreement, one of the things that's really clear is that this need to be okay with our surround in some way, with those around us, has real bodily features. And I wonder, since this was one of the two biggest, trappiest mind traps in this group, I wonder, what have you noticed about yourself and this mind trap in the last couple of weeks? What did you notice about yourself just now is interesting, but even more interesting to me is, what did you notice in the last couple of weeks? is the part where you share what you've noticed in the last couple of weeks.
Well, I'll help you do so. I'll help you out here. Well, when there's awareness of a body sensation, I can detect, okay, this situation, this is how I respond to it, and then I can still decide, okay, do I continue reacting or behaving that way, or do I shift? Or do I stay in a routine and a pattern? So as soon as I detect it, then I can just make the decision. So it helps me to make a decision. Do I continue? Do I change? Do I upscale it, downscale it? Do I step away? Do I move forward? It allows me, it gives me options. It's like a decision moment.
Yeah, and have you been noticing more of those decision moments in the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, there's certain things that I see, okay, there's a pattern here. I'm repeating something. Because I recognize also the emotions with it, also the body sensations. Said, okay, do I want to continue this and that? So right now, like, I'm making a decision. Okay, do I want to continue this behavior? No, yes or no. Maybe I eat something. I say, okay, this type of food give me this type of sensation, and maybe later on also some drowniness or whatever. And I say, okay, although I like it, maybe it might be not the right food. So to speak. Although I might buy it out of habit because I like it initially, but then I see the long-term effect and I say, okay, maybe not a good idea.
I love that. I love that analogy that sometimes the mind trap of agreement feels delicious in the moment.
Yes, it's a trap.
But it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily good for you over time.
No, it's a quick fix, but then maybe not in the long term.
Yeah, and so noticing it and making sense of it, making choices is really helpful. Thank you. Anybody else have a story they want to share about noticing the mind trap of agreement over the last couple of weeks? And remember, you can notice either of these things. You can notice either the way agreement is kind of delicious, or the way we fall out of agreement into polarization. Like, as you saw in that clip, one of the things you might have noticed is that everything led to everything else, right? Like every problem increased their separation from each other and amplified this motion apart, which is, and you saw probably they had some pretty simple stories about each other and about what was going on for the other one. So this question about the mind trap of agreement isn't just when we give in and agree, it's also when we find ourselves backing up away from another person and making ourselves and them simpler in that process. Anybody notice anything like that over the last couple of weeks? I'm seeing Bruce nod. Bruce, you want to join us?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
Thank you. So yes, in the last couple of weeks, I've been with two other family members. One of them is the parent of a son in his early 30s who has severe OCD. And they're negotiating, trying to get him to move as the family has now moved out of state. And they've gotten a home for him. It's been very difficult. And in the meetings and conversations that we've had, I've seen these shifts in pattern and the kinds of listening and responding that have to do with, as you have said, the rightness and the helping and the caring, to this kind of silent, unspoken decision not to really address the core underlying issues, which we all know, and yet nevertheless it's difficult to have those conversations because everyone knows the facts and the patterning and the history of what has in fact been a very complex and difficult challenge. And so for me, watching that clip, it draws me in to see more and more of the verbal and the nonverbal cues and the shifts in tone and meaning and intention that the two characters have. And it certainly reminded me literally of one of the conversations I just had with those people right before I came to this webinar, literally coming from that to this to now watching that story. And it sure resonated for me.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. So I think, thank you for sharing that story, and it sounds super frustrating. And it sounds super like human beings trying to do things, right? And trying and having a conversation here instead of having the deeper conversation that is both scarier and probably more likely to be connecting in the long run and more likely to lead to solutions in the long run. So here I have these questions about how do we learn to and support one another to change our relationship to conflict, maybe not our bodily experiences of conflict, but our capacity to notice those experiences, and as Frederick was saying, to go in any way to have that conversation and to support other people to have it haltingly as well. Joy's letting me know that I'm a little late, which is true. So what do I want to do? The thing I want to do is I want to skip to ego, because that was another one of the trappiest ones of these. And I want to ask you a question for just a minute. I just want you to think back over the last 60 minutes or so and think back about just who you have been being here in this little group. Just let's take this time and think about the things that you said, that you either said aloud or that you put in the chat, and the things that you didn't say, the things that you thought about saying but you decided not to, the things that your fingers were hovering over the keyboard and you almost typed a thing but then you pulled back and you thought, no, I'm not going to say that right now. And I just want you to see whether you can there have a sense of the ego that's driving you here, the person you're wanting to be seen to be. Like what would be your hope for how we might make sense of you? What would be your fear? What was preventing you from typing things when your hands hovered over the keys, or when you almost unmuted but then you decided not to? What were the attributes or qualities that you were sort of hoping people might see about you? And what were some of the things you were trying for us not to see about you? You were kind of pulling away from our seeing. And I just want you to sit with that question for like the next 60 seconds. Just sit with that question and maybe jot notes to yourself. We won't share that together. But just see if you can connect with something that you might learn about yourself, even from this little experience here. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Each of these is, as you know, not meant to highlight a thing that oughtn't happen. It's not in any way that I'm suggesting that we should not be trying to cultivate a particular way that people might be making sense of us, or defending from people, you know, not wanting to think I'm too pushy, or not wanting to think I'm too insensitive, or, you know, whatever those things are. All of that is completely legitimate. The question with this, as with all the other mind traps, is under what circumstances does it drive us, and under what circumstances are we making choices? And when are some of the attributes we're trying to put into the world helpful for us and for the situation we face, and when do they actually get in our way? When are we overdoing that and they become a problem? I'm going to suggest that we spend the next few minutes talking in smaller groups about this. And I think the question I would be most interested in is kind of, what are you learning about yourself through this work we've been exploring, this Mindtraps work we've been exploring? What have you been learning about yourself over the last few weeks or the last hour? What are you learning or noticing about yourself? And if we just share stories of that in the little groups Joy's going to invite us into for like the next 7 minutes-ish, I think we can make some rich connections, and then we'll come back and we'll hold them all together, and we'll see if we can have a solid closing circle a la Sue. Welcome back. You were all forced from your rooms. It's uncommon for us to have to remove 100% of the people by force. So I'm sorry to have pulled you away. And I hope that your conversations were at least the good beginnings of a conversation together. And so I'm using my control here to be sure that we do have time for something like a satisfying close. So there it is. I'd love to hear insights or questions that arose, or noticings, anything you'd like to tell me about your conversations.
Well, I'll say something briefly. I talked about how do we enact, with any of these mind traps, enact a new way of being. And something I didn't get to say in the chat room, but I'll say now, is I think if we can enact them, a new way of being in a small, safe container where we're supported, that helps that shift happen. So if we're doing it on a small scale, then it can globalize more, I think.
Yeah, these small practices, right? How can we find those containers where we can enroll other people too? I think it's funny, this is the first book of mine that my kids were old enough to read, and so it's turned the family into kind of like a Mindtraps little system, right? Where my daughter will say something, and then somebody will say, "Oh, is that a simple story?" And I'll say something, and somebody will say, "I think we're caught by the mind trap of agreement there." So we got like this little thing where we're all in a loving way, kind of, usually it's a loving way, checking in on each other and sharing these stories. Thank you. Any other insight that came up in your conversations, or question or noticing?
Jennifer?
Alyssa, I heard Alyssa.
I'll be really quick. Hi. You know, really, it seems like it all comes down to the trap of ego underneath all of them. I don't know if that is real, but when we were talking about it, we kind of all had, you know, maybe rightness or control, but really at the end of the day, it was about how we're projecting or protecting.
Yeah. In some ways, I wonder whether ego is, in fact, and I've seen this in the chat a little bit as it's flown by, but whether that is the like umbrella chat, the umbrella trap, and the other ones kind of spring out of that place, because each of the traps is there to protect us, right?
Yeah.
And the thing that we're most fundamentally protecting is, who are we being? And are we being the person that I want to be and I want you to see me as? And how does that work? One of the things that's really interesting is that like, I was very curious that so many of you noticed that you were trapped by the ego mind trap. When I asked this of groups of leaders, which the books haven't been out very long, so I haven't done it that many times, but I tend to get just about nobody saying that that's a trap for them. And so that's been, I'm still trying to figure that out. Like, yeah, that's not me. I think that's kind of interesting. I don't know.
Jennifer, we noticed in our group the sort of circular nature of this, that the very process of entering into awareness on these things feels like entering into awareness for the sake of being right, being less controlling, being aware of the ego. And it's kind of like my joke with my husband is always, do these jeans make my rear end look big? If you're asking the question, you already know you're in the trap. So it feels a little bit like that to me.
So interesting. So we look at the trap of rightness so that we can be righter, not so that we can be.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
well, so that we can get out of the trap of rightness, so that we can truly be, or
right.
A different flavor of right?
Yes,
exactly.
Super interesting. I'm gonna have to take that one home and think about it, I think. Yeah, it might be turtles all the way down, it might be like they're just different layers for us to explore, and those layers kind of go on forever. I
do think that just goes back to your comment about ego. Maybe it is just ego at the root.
And once again, I want to say each of these traps has its own beauties, right? Like these are not things for us to think are as being bad in any way. They're reflexes that are natural and normal. And then the question is, when are we caught up in them so much that they're leading us in a path that's not helpful for us in that moment? And can we tell the difference? That's the real question. Can we tell the difference? And can we develop the subtlety and the awareness in ourselves to be better and better at telling the difference about those things? So our time today is over. I want to thank you for coming back again, and to say that there's still one more of these things. And here we are just on this co-exploration of how can we use these ideas in the world. So the plan is for us to meet again in 2 weeks' time. And it's 3 weeks, isn't it, Joy? It's the June 11th. And I'd love you to see in between now and then, if you're game, what is it like to try and use some of these ideas with others, right? So there's a way that they're about us, but there's also a way that they're about how we are with someone else, with a group, with a team, with a client, with a kid, use them implicitly, explicitly. Just how is it that you are noticing that they can shape not just your response, but the way a conversation or a meeting or a problem-solving session goes? And so we're broadening out the circle here to just figure out how do we want to play with them in company and see if we can get traction on these ideas, because as you probably know, I really believe that one of the things that's going to help us collectively is sharing some of these ways we mislead ourselves, and seeing whether there are ways to do less of that and more connecting and more intentional, using complexity to solve some of our most complex challenges instead of forcing ourselves into simplistic spaces there. So I want to say thank you very much for coming and hanging out with us today, and I'll see you soon.